Hey, everybody. So, this is Tyler's take on how to find more shed antlers. So, before we get into how to find more antlers, first, what is a shed? If you're not familiar with it, a shed antler or shed, as most people call it, is nothing more than antlers from a deer, elk, or moose that have fallen off. And yes, if you aren't aware, yeah, deer, elk, moose, they grow antlers every year. They fall off every year. And typically, when they do grow back, they grow back a little bit larger than the year prior, sometimes with even more points than the year before. So you may have a first year buck with antlers for the first time, and he maybe just has 1 point, which people would call a spike. Or maybe they grow and it has 2 points. The next year, those antlers will fall off, and the next year they'll grow back, and maybe there's 3 points or 4 points on one side. And then they'll grow and grow and grow. And not always will they grow more points, but typically what will happen is those points will get longer and then they'll get thicker. And eventually they'll reach a point in age maturity where they'll stop growing. And even at some points, they will decline and they'll get smaller as they get older. But for the purposes of this, they'll grow every year and get bigger. Typically, what happens is deer start to grow their antlers in the spring, in the late spring, somewhere in there. And when they grow them initially, what they'll do is they'll grow out of their head with what people refer to as velvet. They're covered in what looks like fur or hair because it's actually living as it's growing. It's full of blood and inside, but it's covered in velvet. So they'll grow and grow and grow. And then as the fall starts or the breeding season gets closer, what'll happen is those male deer will their testosterone levels will start to increase. And as their testosterone levels increase, those antlers start to harden and it starts to turn into bone. And as the bone starts to harden, what'll happen is then the velvet that's on the exterior of the bone will start to come off. So deer will start to rub their antlers up against the trees and they'll try to peel that velvet off. And sometimes even when the velvet comes off, it'll be bloody because it is organic and they'll leave, blood on the antlers. But usually when the velvet comes off, it's typically when the antlers are completely hardened. And once their antlers are completely hardened, they'll use those antlers then to fight and they'll mark territories. They'll rub it on trees. That's what causes these buck rubs. So they'll do all that. But while the antlers are actually growing, when they actually have velvet on them, they're sensitive. So there is nerve endings inside of those antlers. So, in the fall, you're looking for a buck in some of the thickest areas possible. They can do that and they can use their antlers sometimes to clear their way in. But that's not typically what they'll do in the summer. And because in the summer, those antlers can still hurt if they rub up against things and they're sensitive. So they tend to stay away from those really, really thick areas unless there's severe pressure in the summer while their antlers are in velvet. So that's kind of how the cycle goes. Typically, they shed them sometime a month or 2 or 3 after mating season's over, and then they'll grow back. So for most of the United States, that'll be somewhere that means they're dropping January, February, March. Some bucks will hold antlers through April, and even there's been some photographed in May. But typically, it's January, February, March where the bulk of the antlers are dropped. And then they'll start to grow back in about May, and they'll grow throughout the summer. Antlers grow extremely fast. They're actually one of the fastest growing organisms on Earth. They're certainly the fastest growing bone on Earth. For a white-tailed deer, for example, they can grow up to a half of an inch of antler per day during the growing season. And I have an antler here actually to kind of show you. So this is a whitetail antler. This is one side. This would be from an 8-point buck. So it has 1, 2, 3, 4 points here. So when I say a half of an inch, though, what I'm talking about is not necessarily length and a half of an inch, but a half of an inch of bone. So that could be a combination of length and thickness. So now, when do you start to look for sheds? When should you start to look for sheds? And there's a couple of different responses that I have for that. And you'll find a ton of different responses online. First, we'll start with some of the pros and cons of when to look. So there's an argument to be made that you want to be the first one in the woods. Now, what forces antlers to fall off is a sharp drop in testosterone inside of the deer. So what'll happen is during the mating season, testosterone levels are at peak levels throughout that time. And then after they're done breeding, what'll happen is their testosterone levels will plummet. And that has a part to play in when that antler is shed. So the oldest, most mature bucks, or I'll say the bucks that do the majority of the breeding during the mating season, they will be the ones who lose their antlers first. So a lot of times that is the older bucks because they dominate their area and they will make sure they breed when they want to. And then that leaves some of the younger bucks to actually breed earlier. It doesn't mean younger bucks aren't chasing earlier, but the time when they do the actual breeding might be after the older bucks. And that depends on your area. I know some people are going to say they experience different things in the woods, and that's okay. But the typical rule of thumb is the older bucks will drop their antlers first. So you could be the first one in the woods, and you do stand a chance of finding a big shed antler. Now, that being said, that may be the only antler you find because the rest of the younger bucks are still holding. Also, with that, if you're in first, you could be pushing away the deer that are in that area. So if you're in public land, or excuse me, if you're in private land, for example, if you go into that private land to go look for those first antlers that have shed, and then you find out that no antlers have been shed, well, guess what? Now you may have pushed all the bucks out of that area, and they may now be moving into an adjacent property or your neighbor's property. And guess what? He's going to find all their antlers because he's going to wait till March to go looking. So, use your best judgment on when you want to go in. For me, typically on public land, I don't have private land, so everything I do is public. I typically go in around February to start to move into areas for the first time. A lot of the public land areas that I go into are big tracts of land. So I know even if I push deer a little bit here, if I don't find anything, I can back out, go in another time, and maybe push in a little bit farther. But around February is when I like to start. But most people would tell you probably March is go time. Those are also probably the people that are in there in February. I don't know because they want to get ahead of you. But that's typically how it works, and that's the kind of the best times I would say pros and cons of getting in early or getting in late. Also, though, what time of day that you go in matters as well. Now, there's again different arguments to be made. Obviously, we want to make sure we're taking wildlife into consideration first. We're not just busting into areas trying to find antlers so we can sell them by any means necessary. No, that's the animal's home. It's the wildlife's home. We want to make sure we respect that. So the best times to go in, I would say, would be later on in the day, or maybe a time of day when the deer or the bucks that may be bedding in there have moved on for the day. You run the risk of, if you go in at lunchtime, you're going to run the risk of, pressure, adding, unneeded pressure to bucks that might be in the area that still might be recovering from the cold winter months. Remember, during the rut or during the mating season, they've expended a ton of energy through mating. A lot of them haven't eaten, they're starving, and now it's freezing cold weather. So they're using every ounce of energy to just stay alive at this point. And you going in there and pushing might add to that stress. So keeping that in mind when you go in. Maybe you wait until the end of the day or the morning, depending on when bucks are moving and bedding in your area. But, for the most part, bucks are bedded in the midday. The other thing I would say is find a time of day when you can go in and look when it's overcast. I know, anytime you can get in the woods is a good time to get in the woods. And, if you only have one day, well, guess what? Get in there that day and spend your time in the woods. It's way more important than missing that opportunity and just spending the rest of the time on the couch. I firmly believe everybody needs to spend more time outside. Now, if you have the luxury of picking and choosing a day that is, has slightly overcast or a really gray day, I tend to find, or for me, to be the best days to go in because what you're going to have is see a bright white antler like this, even the brown. What it's going to do is typically a gray day is going to mean maybe there's some moisture in the air or on the ground yet. And this bright white antler is going to stick out like a sore thumb. You're going to have a lot more contrast against the dead, rotting leaves on the ground or even the grass. When it's bright outside, it's going to raise the brightness level of everything in the woods. And suddenly that bright white antler that you're looking for is going to look a little muted because it's going to blend in everything else because everything is brighter. On a darker day, that bright white stands out a lot more. I find the best times to go into the woods is probably February, late January around here when we get the bulk of our snow. We get a good snow. And sometimes those really cold temperatures can add to when those bucks drop their antlers. Well, after that snow melts, when all the snow runs off and the snow melts, the ground is still wet. That's the time I love to get in there because not only might you uncover antlers that have been covered by the snow, but when there's tons of snow on the ground, there's not a lot of guys putting on a lot of miles to go looking. And even if they are, it's going to be hard to find a white antler sitting up against white snow. So after a good snow melt is a great time to get in there. Now, you can't just go into the woods and well, you can, but you shouldn't just if your goal is to find as many antlers as possible, you shouldn't just run into the woods and try to cover ground. You need to plan how you're going to cover ground and what methods you're going to use. Now, we talked about looking for bright white and looking for that contrast. That's the number one rule that I use is looking to find that contrast. Now, look, you're going to have some antlers that maybe have just dropped and they haven't been sun bleached at all, and maybe that deer had a really dark chocolatey color antler, it's not going to stand out as much. And that's okay. You might walk by that one. What we're looking for, it's a numbers game. You can only spend so much time in the woods, so you want to make sure you play the numbers and you want to look for the ones that you can see that stand out. So I look for that bright white. Also, what I'm looking for are tines. So if you look at this antler, this has a lot, this has a much different structure to this antler than most other things in the woods. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, there's sticks all over the woods. And that's true, but they don't look like this. Every once in a while, and you're going to have this, you're going to walk through the woods and you're going to see something that looks like an antler. That's okay. It gives you a little jolt of excitement. You run over to it only to say, oh, it's not an antler. It's just a stick. That's okay. That's not going to happen all the time. But if you can look for these tines, these points, right? If you're looking for that, you're going to filter out a lot of the other stuff that's in the woods. Just like when I'm looking for deer, typically I tell people if you're walking through the woods and you want to get better at spotting deer, look for horizontal lines in the woods. Everything in the woods is typically vertical, standing up straight. And a deer, especially their back, is horizontal. So if I'm looking for those horizontal lines, my eyes are going to catch that a lot easier than it is for a light brown deer walking through the woods. Like, come on, get out of here. That's going to be incredibly difficult to find. But if I'm looking for those lines, it's different than everything else. My odds are going to go up. So I apply the same rules when looking for antlers. So looking for those tines. Also, if you want to get better at spotting these things, it sounds silly, but grab some antlers that you already have or your buddy has, or that you can buy, whatever it is, or you can go to the store and buy some fake rattling antlers or whatever it is, and go out into the woods and place them out into the woods somewhere and then back off and walk in and see when you spot them. I think you'd be surprised at how close you can get to one of these antlers before you see it. Or I think you'd be surprised at how many antlers you can walk by and never see it. I know I've put on hundreds of miles in the woods walking, trying to find shed antlers, and I'm sure I've walked by maybe hundreds of antlers. I know some areas I walk through that I know there's antlers sitting there because I know they hold big bucks or just bucks in general. And I might walk through an entire area. Maybe I'm scatterbrained that day or I'm thinking about what to make for dinner or what happened at work or whatever it is, and I'm not paying attention. I know I'm walking by antlers, and it'll prove itself by the end of the day when I have nothing to show for it. So I might walk through that same area again the next day and boom, I find antlers that I might have missed before. But with that, to have a method as to how you're going to comb an area. So don't just run into an area and start zigzagging and doing this and that. Try to understand, okay, what does the area look like that I'm going into? And then how am I going to cover the ground the most efficient way? And look, thorns and stickers and all this stuff might dictate where you're able to get to and where you're not. But generally speaking, if you have a square area, all right, what I like to do is just like if you were looking at, I don't know, I'm thinking about if I was doing a word search and I'm trying to find areas. I usually scan lines back and forth to look for a starting letter. Well, it's the same way I do it with antlers. I'm going to walk up over a little bit and walk down. Just do a basic grid search. And if you do that, you're going to minimize the amount of areas that you miss. You can download apps like Onyx Hunt or Hunt Stand or any of these other hunting apps you can use, or even just Google, I think, has a track search function on it where it'll track your movements. That way, if you kind of get lost in the woods, you can look at your app and see what ground that you've covered and get yourself back on track. Find out how far you can see from left to right and then kind of base your width of your grid search on that. If you run into an area that you just can't get to because it's too, tied up with thorns. I was in the other day and I pierced my ear about three more times on my right side here because I tried to get into an area and if that thorn bush grabbed a hold of me and pulled me backward, I felt like it was like a scene from Jumanji or something. But there's going to be areas you just can't get into. and that's okay. Just go around them and try to get yourself back on track. So having that again, using those apps. When you do find antlers, plot those on your maps or on X. Plot that point there so you know to come back to it the next year. You'd be surprised at how many times shed antlers tend to drop in the same areas. And it's not because they're falling off in the same areas. You just got lucky. It's probably because those are areas that bucks are bedding in this time of year. Remember, bucks are bedding in different areas now than they were back in the rut or when they were back in August or September. Their feeding patterns are different. They're not during in the mating season. They're not as pressured as they were in October or November. They finally have some breathing room, but they're also trying to stay alive by eating and drinking. So their bedding areas are going to change up. And identifying where you find the bulk of your antlers can give you a lot of intel as to where those bucks are spending the majority of their time in the winter time. Which brings me up to the next point, which would be gathering intel. Shed hunting is great, and if you walk out of the woods with a bucket or a backpack full of antlers, that's great. What I love to use shed hunting season for, we'll call it shed hunting season. What I like to use that for is to gather intel for next year's hunt. There's no better time than to be in the woods in the late winter when everything's dead, there's no foliage on the trees, and you can see crystal clear every tree that buck has rubbed his antlers up against. You can see leftover scrapes. Prints and tracks are easy to see in the ground because it's typically moist due to snowfall or precipitation, and the ground in the woods is exposed a little bit more than it was in the fall when it was piled up with leaves. So you can see more dirt. You can see where those tracks are. You can find trails extremely easy in the wintertime. You don't have all that foliage to work with, so you'll find heavily beaten down trails. Take all that data, make sure you have your map or your phone or a pen and paper or whatever method you use to track all this data, have it with you those days that you're out and write all this stuff down. You would be amazed at how many new stands you'll find for next fall when you're shed hunting. Cause you're like, I had no idea bucks, you better believe if you find giant areas of rubs and, old scrapes, that buck was probably using that area during the rut. Based on how much cover he had, you can tell, was he using it at night or was this a midday spot that he was laying down all this sign? Take that stuff, record it, and you might just find your next rut stand for next year. So finding that intel, I also look for droppings on the ground because the ground is moist, and in the wintertime, if you're in areas that get really cold, the ground can freeze. And what can happen is those bucks or deer will move through an area, they'll leave a big print, and then it'll get really cold and that print will freeze. And that print might stay there for weeks and months even. That print might be there until the next big rain when everything thaws out. So when you find these tracks, you might be thinking, oh, I found where they're at. I found the honey hole. What you might actually be looking at are tracks that he laid down in early December. And now it's mid-March, but the ground hasn't thawed completely yet. And you're getting, so looking for those tracks, but also looking for fresh droppings. Based on the droppings, there's a whole nother segments that we'll get into on maybe the different types of droppings and, are they clumped? Are they not? Depending on whether they were bedding for a while when they were droppings that happened while they were on the move, this and that. But if you find fresh droppings, okay, he was here, middle of the day, and that's when he was using the spot. So when it comes to what do you carry into the woods when you go shed hunting, look, you can grab a water bottle or grab your cell phone and head on into the woods with nothing. But typically, if I'm going into the woods, I bring a couple things. Number one, I'm going to wear some type of waterproof boot. Doesn't have to be big muck boots or knee-high rubber boots. Any kind of waterproof Merrell hiking shoe or anything like that. That's typically what I use in the winter. Something that's comfortable. You can put on a lot of miles in, but you can also get wet. It's going to be soggy. The ground's going to be wet from snow or dew or rain. So you should expect to get wet in your feet. So make sure you have something waterproof. Comfortable socks, obviously. The biggest piece of advice I can give you when it comes to clothing is to wear durable clothing. So that means wear heavy duty blue jeans or some type of ripstop material, or some pants from different companies they offer heavy duty pants. Basically what you're looking to try to do is wear anything that is not easily going to get snagged by thorns. When you're shed hunting, you're going to be, it's like an Easter egg hunt. You're going to be out there and you're going to get excited and you're going to see sheds in areas, or you're going to see trails going into these really thick areas and you're going to want to get in there. Well, it's going to upset you if you go and crawl into an area and you're wearing your Lululemon joggers or, sweatpants or whatever else it is, your a nice hoodie of yours or whatever it is you're wearing, and it's getting snagged and holes are ripped in it from thorns, or it's just frustrating more than anything. So I like a heavy duty pair of jeans and then some type of a jacket, like some kind of wind jacket or something that has some type of ripstop material on it that you can really bust through and not have to worry about any of that. Doing that, wearing gloves, and then making sure you bring a bag to put your sheds in. And then if you're covering a lot of miles, some kind of water source. And then the number one piece of gear to bring is binoculars. I can't stress enough how important binoculars are for shed hunting. And you might be saying, oh, I'm going into a woods where, I can't see very far or it's really thick. Bring your binoculars. And it doesn't have to be a giant pair. This could be an 8X or, I like to bring a 10X set of binoculars, but you can cover a lot more ground, not physically, but your eyes can cover a lot more ground if you use binoculars. I like to, if I can, anytime, some guys go as far as to bring a tree stand into the woods or wearing their saddle in, getting a little, maybe, 6 feet off the ground, 5 feet off the ground and scanning the area with their binoculars. I don't take it that far. If I find a stump or a log or a high hill, a little hill or something I can get on, I'll do that and I'll scan an area with binoculars. You'll cover 10 times more ground by doing that than trying to put your boots on the ground in every one of those spots. Especially if I come to a clearing, I stop what I'm doing, take my binoculars out, get to the highest point I can and scan that area. And I'm looking for white, I'm looking for tines, I'm looking for that contrast. And I can scan an entire field, depending on the size, with my binoculars and never have to go in there and walk it. Obviously, you might find like something that catches your eye. Oh, is that an antler? Are those sticks? Hey, go in there, investigate it. But now you don't have to cover that whole area. And the same thing goes for the woods. Remember, it's about efficiency. We all only have so much time in the woods. Hey, if you're retired and you don't have any other place to be other than in the woods, God bless you. I'm jealous, but that's not me. I only have so much time that I can dedicate to being in the woods. So I like to use that time as efficiently as possible and making sure my eyes can cover as much ground is the way to do it. Now, look, we could go on for days on different tricks or different gear that you can bring or things like guys wear certain sunglasses and all this other stuff. I don't think any of that's necessary. Those few basic items I think will get you through. And what areas do I like to focus on? Now, this is going to depend on the location that you're at. So obviously, if you're shed hunting down south, your terrain's going to look a little bit different. Or if you're out west, your terrain's going to look a lot different than it is here for me in Pennsylvania. And, me in Pennsylvania is going to look a lot different than you down in Florida. So it's going to depend. But for your colder climate areas, like where you're going to have snow and extreme cold temperatures, typically you're going to find that you want to look or focus your efforts in southern facing slopes. Those are going to be areas that receive the most amount of sunlight and receive the most amount of that thermal warmth that they're going to get throughout the day. Because again, they're trying to stay alive at this point. So any warmth that they can get for free, they're going to go for. If they can't get warmth from the sun, that means they got to be on their feet. They got to be eating. They got to be moving. So if they can lay down in an area and soak up the sun a little bit, that's where they're going to be. So those south facing slopes is a lot of times where they'll spend the bulk of their time in the winter. They spend the bulk of their time there. That means the bulk of the antlers are going to be there. So that's where I would focus first if you have terrain that, has that available to you. If you don't have that, or if you want to use something else in addition to that, what I would look at are bedding areas or areas that deer are going to spend the majority of their time. Bedding areas I've found to be they produce extremely well just because deer spend a lot of time in their bedding areas, especially if it's in heavily forested areas that are thick areas that they just feel safe in, especially on public land. They're going to spend the most of their time there. So checking out those bedding areas, and that's where, you're going to have to get into some thick areas that you might not want to be in, but hey, you got to pay the price to get what's nice if you know what I mean. So you're going to have to get into those areas and just suck it up and crawl on the ground and get yourself in there. Other areas that are really good to focus on are fields. If you have a food plot in a private land setting, or even if you have a food plot in a public land setting next to that, maybe it runs up against a a cornfield or soybean field or something like that, working those edges are going to be great. I mean, deer spend a lot of time working edges in between habitat. So if you can look at those edges, you'll always find an edge, that field edge between the field and the woods. You're going to have these big, heavily beaten trails. So focusing your efforts there are going to produce. And then out in the field, if it's a cut cornfield that still has some stalks left over and maybe a little bit of corn that's dropped from when they harvested it, man, you could have deer out in those fields. A lot of farmers will plant some type of native grass in the winter. So, deer are going to eat that green stuff up. They're going to spend a lot of time in the fields. And again, where they spend most of the time is where you're going to find most of the sheds. Now, if you're covering just areas inside of open hardwoods, it can be difficult because it could be wide, it could be open, it could be big. In those areas, if grid searching is just not, it's not a smart move, or you don't have enough time to do that, it's not efficient. What I do is stick to trails. You're gonna find trails. They're gonna be easily identifiable because everything's dead. And get yourself on a trail and just follow it. And man, it'll lead you into some areas that you maybe didn't even know existed. And then start just hopping trails, find the next trail, find the next trail. I always tell somebody if I'm in the woods with them, for the first time, if we get onto a deer trail, I'm like, what's at the end of every deer trail? Oh, a deer. So, I mean, there's a deer there. It made it. There's a deer at the end of that trail somewhere, and somewhere along the line, he's going to lose an antler. So you stay on this trail for long enough, you're bound to find an antler. It might take you days, weeks, months, but you're going to find them if you can stick on that trail. So yeah, definitely focusing on those areas is where I'd be. Okay. Other than that, I mean, it's not rocket science. Get into the woods, use your time efficiently, find a way to cover the most amount of ground as possible with your eyes and have a good time. And you know what? Cover one area, get out, go back in another time and cover that area. And guess what? If you come up empty and you can't find a whole lot, that's what turkey season's for, baby. Get in there during turkey season. A lot of states, like in Pennsylvania here, a lot of states you can only hunt, at least in the first couple of weeks, until 12 o'clock anyways. So let's be honest, you know, most of us are only turkey hunting until we hear the last gobble anyways. And sometimes that'll come at 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. Hunt till then. And now guess what? You've already told the wife that you've gone for the day to hunt, or you're gone till 12. So now you got 2 hours to shed hunt. So, the risks of doing the most of your shed hunting that late into the spring, May, April, May is, the rodents will get to it. A lot of antlers will get really sun bleached and they'll be super white. But hey, an antler's an antler. I've got tons of antlers that have a ton of cool character because they've been sitting around for a while. So I never miss an opportunity to get into the woods, especially, when it comes to finding one of these. Another thing too, hey, if you have kids or you have friends that maybe they don't want to come hunting with you, but want to get into the woods, this is a great time to get your kids into the woods. It's an Easter egg hunt. Offer up, hey, $5 to the first one who finds an antler, or $1 for every antler you find, whatever that dollar amount is for you, 50 cents a quarter, or maybe we'll get ice cream on the way home if you find an antler. You can cover a ton of ground with that many people and really have a good time doing it. So those are my tips for shed hunting. And, we can go on and on about other tips another time, but I think those are the basics to get you going. So hopefully you found this helpful. And if you did, go ahead and give me a thumbs up, all that other YouTube algorithm stuff, subscribe. I haven't gotten that lingo down yet, but we'll get there. Stay tuned for more videos like this, and I hope to see you soon. Take care.